Hello there, Mr. Stromberg here. Uh, we're going to be learning about three more artists today in modern art. We're talking about modern art. Remember last time we talked about two giants of modern art in the 20th century, Matisse and Picasso. And today we're going to be talking about three other very important artists and their contributions to modern art. So remember that you can sort of think about art up to the beginning of the 1900s as the trunk of a tree, right? You've got one successive movement after another, and then once modernism comes into full swing, it branches off into all these different isms, all these different avenues for artists to explore art. Many of them believing they're pushing art to crazy, strange new places, and they aren't necessarily sequential, but they're all sort of going in different ways. And so we'll see that today with the three artists that we're going to look at. I also want to just say from the outset that modern art is a tricky thing to understand. I have a lot of people who come talk to me to just about the state of contemporary art nowadays, and they get angry about it, and it's difficult to understand. And maybe you feel that way. Maybe you see some of the works that we'll see today, and think to yourself, "How is that art? If I could do that." That will definitely be something you'll think about at least once today. And I just want to say, some of this art might upset you for that reason. And what I want to say is, uh, uh, and we'll get a better grasp on this in the next 2 or 3 weeks as we talk more about modern art. But modern art is not necessarily about creating something more visually or beautifully expressive than what came before. Perhaps it's about taking on an entirely new way of thinking about making art. And maybe the importance of the work has just as much to do with the idea behind the work than the physical look of the work itself. That's a difficult thing to understand, but hopefully it'll start to make sense as we go forward here. So keep an open mind and try to wrap your head around the three works we're going to talk about today. The first one is this one right here, a painting that's probably quite familiar because it's one of the most famous images in the world. This is The Scream. The Scream by an artist named Edvard Munch. And Munch is spelled Munch, so Munch, but pronounced Munch. The Scream by Edvard Munch. Um, one of these works that's ridiculously world famous and has sort of um, now passed the importance of probably the artist who created it. But we have to highlight it because it's that well known, and it also, I think, is a perfect example of the thinking behind art earlier in the 1900s. So we'll go quick through Munch. Munch is a Norwegian artist. Okay, Norway, not a hotbed for modern art, but there is a lot of interesting art happening all over the place. Here he is, a self-portrait here with a cigarette is the name of the piece, and actually quite scandalous, even though it's not scandalous to us now because apparently at the time only the common people would have smoked cigarettes over cigars. Here he is, posing with very confidently with the cigarette, to kind of claiming himself as being on the side of the common people or the people in the lower social class. But first thing you'll notice here about Munch is just the way that the paint is applied. It's much scratchier. Parts of the painting feel completely incomplete on purpose. We see a lot of figures that have this stylized, rounded, almost ghostly look to them. Feels a lot like a dream, or they feel detached from reality. Figures sometimes appear to be floating in space. Sometimes they look at us with this hollow stare, and that's probably something that's common to a lot of his work. And so, what's it all about? Well, there's a lot going on in the world of modernism, not just art, but in all branches of uh, sciences and literature and uh, many, many different outside ideas influencing art. And one of those is the whole um, uh, advancing field of psychology and the idea of trying to figure out what's actually going on in the human mind. We'll see that theme played out with our next artist as well today. But this fascinating idea of how do you show the psychological um, mystery to life, right? How do you get deeper into somebody's um, mental state, and maybe art can harness that as well and show you things you wouldn't otherwise see. Here we see figures around a deathbed here in mourning, and this hollow-faced girl looking at us almost like she's the ghost, right? With the green face here. So yeah, there's a scary kind of hollowed out faced feeling to a lot of his pictures, but also they feel more like strange psychological experiments. And that's because Monk was really interested in that. He read a lot and I think was interested in trying to explore mental states, through his work. And so that's what they feel like. They feel like uncomfortable mental spaces in a lot of ways. And he allows figures to melt into their environments and flat shapes to happen, and all of these other visual things that were common to expressionism at the time. So think back to Matisse and his brightly colored flattened areas and figures that appear to be floating. I mean, this is in the vein with that, but also I think further detached and a little more cerebral, psychological, and intentionally strange, as opposed to just brightly colored joy of life, which is what Matisse was after. This seems to be kind of the opposite. So there are actually other versions of the Scream as well, or other versions that show this bridge and this brightly colored sky. By the way, in recent years, a copy of the Scream, is now one of the most valuable works of art ever sold at an auction. So kind of crazy to think about too. It's not even the real one, but just a paper drawing for it was sold for over $100 million, I believe, a couple of years ago. Here's a self-portrait of Munch as an older man, and again, you can see just how it's very much acknowledging the fact that it's a loose painting and not a polished in any sort of way. So what is it about the Scream? Why is it so famous? What's it actually depicting? Well, there's a bridge, a wooden bridge in Oslo, Norway. And Munch wrote in his diary one night that he was out for a walk across the bridge in the evening when he saw the most dazzling sunset. And they actually have coordinated the same sunset from the year he painted this picture with a explosion of a volcano in Iceland, which would have drifted all that volcanic ash over across Scandinavia. And it would have, of course, made for some absolutely gorgeous sunsets. All of those ash particulates in the air lighting up literally like the sky is on fire. Munch writes in his diary that he felt as if all nature was screaming at him. And then he went back and made this picture of the Scream, which is this personified howling ghost here, cradling its face, and just extremely bright, fire to the sky up above and the city harbor in the distance. It's a deliberate attempt to depict the psychological reaction to something as visceral as a sky that just appears as if it's on fire with sunset. So since then, parodied so many times over. I mean, it's still a huge part of pop culture. And, for that reason, remains one of the most famous images in the history of art. And by far the most, important painting of Edvard Munch's. Let's keep moving. I do like it as a diversion just to talk about psychology and art because it just goes to show how outside influences are playing a huge part on what artists are doing now into the 1900s. So here we go. Very important artist here. This is Salvador Dali, D-A-L-I, Salvador Dali. And the name of this picture is The Persistence of Memory. The Persistence of Memory. And this is another painting you may have seen, also extremely famous, often parodied, and an important part of pop culture as well. So Dali is the founder of a group of artists, founder and leading artist of a group of artists who call themselves the Surrealists. Okay, so Surrealist painting. And Surrealist painting has a strange idea, and it's that, you can use the tools of art to deny the laws of physics, to experiment with strange psychological effects, not unlike what Munch was doing, but in this case, almost heightened real or beyond real, surreal. And you can create these strange dreamscapes, nightmarescapes almost, that deal with the subconscious human mind and trying to understand human psychology. So, one of the fields in art that was huge at the time, or debates, I'm sorry, not in art, but in psychology, was this whole idea of the subconscious mind, or what actually happens to the thoughts in your brain. And so I guess the best way to possibly think about this and to wrap your head around what Dali's trying to do here with this crazy painting, I'm sure that we all understand what it means to have dreams, right? And I know that it's, I mean, it's probably universal that every single one of us can remember a point where perhaps you had a very, very strange dream at night. Like when you woke up, you're almost laughing because it seemed so real in your head, but it was so strange and odd. And then you get up and you get dressed and you have some breakfast and you go to school and you go about your day. And what happens to that thought? It disappears. You can remember that you had the dream, but if you don't write it down, it tends to just completely vanish from your mind, which is a very strange thing to think about, right? Why does our brain, press flush uh, and get rid of those specific thoughts, which seem so crazy real in your head when you blink yourself awake in the morning after an odd dream? That's the whole idea of the subconscious mind, that all of those thoughts are in there. It's just we have to find a new way to access them. The same with suppressed memories and all of that. A very, odd, strange psychological debate here. So Dali took it one step further. I mean, he was such a strong believer in the subconscious mind and the power of what was actually happening in dreams that he got all his paints ready before he'd go to bed. And so if he had a particularly strange dream, he would just, when he woke up in the morning, sit up on the side of his bed and lean over past his bedstand, pull the canvas over to his bed, and start painting and try to paint it before he forgot it. Or at least that's what he said. Now, even about this painting. And if that's true, boy, he had some crazy dreams. But that was what he claimed, and it was a big part of the surrealist movement, trying to understand the subconscious human mind. So, what's actually happening here in this painting called "The Persistence of Memory"? We have this surreal landscape, quite heightened in terms of light and shade and everything, and actually really exquisitely, beautifully painted. Except the colors are all kind of a little bit off, and it doesn't seem totally real. It's shaded like something that's real, but it also seems further detached with kind of this sickly yellow, green, brown tinge. You have, believe it or not, that melting flesh-colored thing in the bottom there. That's actually what Dali said was a self-portrait. So you can see a little bit of a nose facing down, a little bit of an eye, a closed eye with eyelashes there. And then you have clocks, okay, which are drooping and are basically liquid. And so what's that signify? That we're in a place where time, even time itself, doesn't apply, right? Time itself is melting away. And then you have ants and insects there, and those often repeat themselves in Dali's pictures as a sign of decay. So the ants crawling over top of this timepiece or these watches here. So yeah, an extremely strange painting. Also very small. If you ever go to New York City, it's at the Museum of Modern Art, hanging right next to Van Gogh's Starry Night, actually, and it's tiny. I mean, it's not much bigger than a piece of printer paper. So, exquisitely painted with an extremely tiny brush. So, the best way to think about Dali is the word weird. I mean, it's an overused adjective, but that's what he would have wanted. Is intentionally embracing the weirdness as well. Now, if you think it's just his work that's weird, here's a picture of Salvador Dali in a photograph here. He was a larger-than-life personality, also born in Spain, and very much part of the same Spanish lineage that gave us Velázquez and Picasso, who we talked about last time. And was a proud Spaniard. He had this ridiculous mustache, okay, which became kind of his trademark later in life, that he used to wax and pull up, above his eyeballs. And he was really one of the first celebrities to come up with this idea that when he acted weirder, or when he did things that were outside the social norm, or when he gave crazy interviews, it only seemed to draw more attention to his art, which is nowadays what people do all the time. Just think of the cult of celebrity. We'll talk more about it later. But Dali acted extremely strange. I would encourage you to go on YouTube sometime and just click in Salvador Dali interview. And he had this huge mustache, and he would bug his eyes out like this, and often he would wear ridiculous clothes. There's all these surrealist films that he made where he's hatching out of an egg, like a giant human-sized egg, and he was over the top weird, but very much on purpose. And the idea, again, draw more attention to yourself, make yourself an extension of your art, and the weirdness embraced in the art, which was enormously influential going forward. He's a real pioneer in that. So a few more Dalis here. I love looking at these because they really are visual puzzles. They often are quite unsettling. Colors are sort of sickly colored, and they definitely make you uncomfortable a lot of the time, just in their color and their layout, because there's things that are recognizable about, but also just so strange. He's a big fan of using repeating motifs, or one symbol that repeats over and over again. So, lots of times a shape will be repeated. So look all the way to the right side of the picture here. You can see in this landscape, there's a little tiny dresser with a bottle on the top, and then a hole in the bigger dresser that's the exact same shape, right? Or this person who's sitting on the beach has a hole through them with this crutch holding it up. You'll see the crutch repeat too. The crutch implies weight and depth, even though this is a flattened painting that he's painting here. Floating boats on by this sickly shore. I mean, it's nightmarish, but it's also just real enough that it kind of turns your stomach a little bit to have this sickly green color going on. Lots of times, they're quite deep, and I can't go into full depth on all of these. I mean, I could research and figure it out, but lots of times there are visual riddles or puns going on, or the whole idea that you could see two different things or hidden images. That's something that appealed to Dali a lot. So this will be a tricky one without having the chance to discuss it with other people here, but I would encourage you to look. First of all, look at the whole picture. We have this figure seated at a table off to the left here, but also look at, in the distance, there's a whole bunch of figures standing under this, what looks to be almost like a Roman ruin or something. In particular, look right smack dab in the center of the picture. Above this chalice, there's some figures. Right in the center of the picture there are two figures that are standing together. They're wearing black robes, almost like priest's robes, and they've got white robes underneath, black robes. You can see their two heads there. Now zoom out and blur your eyes a little bit, and you'll see that from the shape of the ruin behind them, that opening, their heads become a woman's eyeballs if you blur your eyes a little bit, and you can see the edge of a nose and a chin. Now, if you can't see that, just blur your eyes, squint a little bit, and pause the video and look closer. But the whole idea that you could paint one thing, and then depending on who's looking at the painting and their perspective and their view, you would see one or the other thing, or possibly both. That's a fantastic idea in terms of art, and something that Dali would have absolutely loved, right? The fact that you could hide things in a work of art. Whenever I show this painting in the class, it seems like half the people see one image, half the people see the other, and it ends up being a pretty interesting comparison. Lots of times, at first glance, they appear to be somewhat normal, and then the closer you look, the more horrific they become. Look at this one. It almost looks like a rock formation or a landscape here, and then you look close and you see that it's strange amorphous body parts, hands pinching things, holding forks and spoons and knives. Just a super weird painting, and again, very much painted that way on purpose. Repeating motifs. So here we have, again, surreal landscape, strange colors, figures in the distance, the chessboard. These are all, things that tend to repeat themselves. And then two large stone statues or monoliths next to a reflective pool. The yellow one here, if you look, takes the form of a person, a nude figure who is kind of seated with their knee up and their forehead resting on their knee. And you can see the other monolith, which is the same shape, is a hand holding an egg. So, again, strange, odd way of comparing forms. intentionally embracing strangeness and weirdness. There's a lot being done at this time in terms of um, uh, psychological theories of human sexuality. And if you've heard of Sigmund Freud, was writing a lot of his theories as well. And these were all enormously influential to the surrealists who took it into this strange area of art where they could paint some of these odd scenes. I won't even attempt to go into depth on this one, but again, the point of this art is not to make you, happy and cheerful through its expression, is it? It's to instead get at something deeper and more sinister about our human nature and the way that our brains think. Uh, Sometimes they're more humorous. This one's always cracks me up a little bit. Just these impossible, possibly heavy shapes held up by these crutches, which just seem so long and thin. See that repeated all the time. Repeating motifs. Here we have insects again, which always seem to show decay, or in this case, kind of organized decay. Look at these two. I don't know if you can see here, but in the center, wearing green, and to the right, wearing red, there are two versions of the Venus de Milo, which is a very famous ancient Roman female nude Venus statue. But blur your eyes and turn your head just a little bit diagonal, and you'll see that there's actually two human faces hidden in there as well. So another hidden image. This one always cracks me up, just animals that are impossible. Things, again, bending the laws of physics. Here we have, it's like half elephant, half daddy long legs spider, right? Impossibly long, thin, can't support weight. But supporting, in this case, a city on its back. I mean, it's the kind of thing that could happen in your nightmare or your dream. And then you think about it afterwards, and you're like, okay, that makes no sense whatsoever, and that was ridiculous. Here, Dali's attempting to paint it. Dali lived a pretty long life. So at the end of his life, quite famous, was still making really influential work. Look closely at this one right here. We have a nude female figure here, gazing out of an odd-shaped window. But step back and blur your eyes a little bit, and you can actually see that this is another double image. It's a pixelated portrait of Abraham Lincoln. In fact, you can see towards the bottom left center there's a little picture of Abraham Lincoln. And so, yeah, what a strange, odd thing. Dali actually lived in America as well, had a house in Florida as well as in Spain, which today in Florida, I believe in the St. Petersburg era, there's a big Dali museum where you can see this picture and others too. Surrealist sculpture was a thing as well. I mentioned before that he did films too, crazy films where odd things happen, but also the idea of sculpture. So, for all you young people, this is a telephone. Back when, before they had backlit screens, where you actually had to pick up a receiver and hold it to your head. But, just imagine the phone rings and you got to pick it up, but it's, not a receiver. It's actually a real live pinching lobster here. This is the lobster telephone, an absurdist, surreal sculpture. So one of the amazing things about Dali, something that I love to talk about is, he lived a long time, made so much work, was a really famous international art figure, lived this crazy weird life intentionally in public, but he had a fascinating private life as well. He was had a difficult upbringing. He was actually had an older brother who had died before he was born, who was also named Salvador Dali, and then his parents, when he was born, named him Salvador Dali. So his whole life had a weird psychological effects of feeling like, was he his reincarnated brother, or, is he somewhat at fault, or why should he have survived and his brother didn't? It led him to become a real atheist and walk away from his Roman Catholic upbringing for most of his life. But at the end of his life, he began to embrace a lot of these church themes, Catholic themes, looking at the history of art, even art from the Middle Ages that we would have looked at earlier, except he remade these as surreal paintings. And so these are kind of crazy. So here, for example, is a Dali crucifixion. And you can see, just, look at that little figure down there at the bottom left, how gorgeously painted it is. I mean, he's ridiculously skilled as a painter in terms of painting realism. But then he's also putting a very surrealist spin on it here. So you'll see this Christ is being held on this cross that's kind of invisible behind him. It's not actually making contact with his hands. And it's this very odd shape that you have there behind him, sort of, strange three-dimensional cross. First of all, showing that he's choosing to be there on the cross, right? He's not physically nailed to it, but he's actually choosing to stay there in that position. He's not physically bound to it at all. And then a very odd thing he's doing here, which, is mind-blowing and hard to kind of get into here, but the shape, there's actually a well-known shape in mathematics, and maybe some of you have seen this before. This is called the four-dimensional object. And if you want to have your mind blown, just stare at this animation for a little while. You see how it's both inside and outside at the same time. A crazy weird object. But if you take this, it's called the hypercube, and you unfold it and translate it into 3 dimensions, that is the shape it creates. It creates a cross or a T shape on an X and Y axis here. So anyway, he's melding a really complex mathematical, unknowable object, something we can't possibly wrap our heads around, as the cross of Christ here. In other words, we can't possibly fully understand Christ's sacrifice. So, wow, what a cool way to combine in a way that isn't ground to physical reality here. Just some really deep ideas together all in one. Some other ones here from this late series that he did, kind of elongated, strange view looking down from the cross here. We also have, here's Dali's Resurrection. This is the kind of thing that would be impossible to paint if it was just one particular scene, but just think of what we're seeing here. We see this Christ-type figure with feet pushed directly towards us. He's dead. He's actually, you can see the lava, there he's in a hellish landscape. And the Spirit, okay, which is seen by this dove of the Holy Spirit, but also of a woman's face. That's actually Dali's wife, who modeled for him. It's blowing this bluish orb of life back into him, and his fingers curl almost like he's Frankenstein's monster being energized by lightning and coming back to life. And then bursting around him is actually the zoomed in view of a sunflower in full bloom. So a sunflower bursting to life here. So, this is the kind of thing, to take those outside strange visuals, put them all together in a way to show the resurrection is a pretty powerful thing. And also just a really interesting painting. The story about this one too is that Dali was obsessed with trying to get this view of the human body looking straight at the feet, but he couldn't find a way to have a model lay in such a way that worked. And so he actually had a hole ripped above his canvas and easel in the ceiling, and had a model stand on top of it, on top of some glass above his head, so that he could look up in order to get this view of the feet and the torso from below. I'll leave you with this one for Salvador Dali here. We've looked at lots of Last Supper scenes. This is Dali's Last Supper. Think back to all the way back to Leonardo's Last Supper, and you can see here how God in Dali's scene here is actually a transparent torso who has his arms raised out here to welcome in and to hug and embrace everyone through this act of communion. But it's also intentionally very strange. His Christ is kind of skeletal and odd, and again, Dali's embracing the weirdness here. Just kind of interesting to see how he's taking a surrealist take on these classic medieval church themes of biblical art. So there you go, Salvador Dali, embracing the weird, psychological, surrealist take on art. All these artists are working at similar times, by the way, too. So just goes to show how people are branching art into all kinds of different directions. Final one for today is this one. This is Mondrian, which is spelled Mondrian, M-O-N-D-R-A-I-N, Mondrian. His name was Piet Mondrian, Frenchman, Piet Mondrian. And the name of this piece should be one that's easy to remember because it's pretty silly. The name of this picture is Broadway Boogie Woogie. Broadway Boogie Woogie. So Broadway, and then Boogie Woogie is B-O-O-G-I-E, Woogie, W-O-O-G-I-E. Broadway Boogie Woogie. Broadway after Broadway in New York City. Boogie Woogie after this free-flowing jazz music. It's called Boogie Woogie music. We'll come back and talk about Broadway Boogie Woogie in a moment. But let's talk about Piet Mondrian for a second. You've probably seen this particular look of art. It's a kind of what we call minimalism, where the object tends to disappear, and instead we're left with these primary colors, red, yellow, blue, and vertical, horizontal lines. This is really difficult art for people to understand. This is a lot of art that people say, how is that art? And I would say I understand, and let's try to understand a little bit. So here's a photo of Mondrian. As you can see, a happy, fun-loving guy. Actually, no, by any by all stretches of the imagination, a super serious guy who thought his work was, the future of art, and basically all there was to do. So how do we get to this point? There were artists, even in the early 1900s, who believed that um, the only thing that was left to do, like all art had sort of been done to some extent. You could have variations, but the biggest ideas in art had sort of been accomplished once people are allowed to do whatever they want. So their idea was really the only thing left to do with art is to scale it back to its bare essentials, to its core makeup. And so if you take any sort of color, any color in painting, and you reduce it, you can reduce it to its, mainly three colors here, which is yellow, red, and blue. Those are the primary colors. You don't mix other colors together to get those. And then you can, also you have white and black, okay, for the lightness or darkness of that color. And with those colors, you can sort of make any other color. So, they reduced their palettes to that. And then they simplified things along a grid to horizontal and vertical lines. There's a whole group of these painters. They call themselves the De Stijl artists. That's Dutch for the style is what it means, the style. So that's how strongly they believed. Like they named their art movement the style, or basically the only way art is supposed to be would be another way of saying it. And they felt very, very strongly that that was the case. Thank goodness they were wrong. But as you'll see, these works, were extremely influential in all kinds of other areas as well. So this was an extremely important movement because it sort of was bleak and hopeless and scaled back to bare essentials of abstraction, but it also, showed entirely new ways of thinking. So to the person who would say to themselves, how is this art? I could paint a bunch of colored squares, and if that one could sell for millions of dollars at a museum, why can't I do that? Well, the difference is you didn't think of it in 1921 like Piet Mondrian did. And it's an extremely important, new way of thinking in art, regardless of, if we're supposed to enjoy it or not. I think one of the things we saw last week with Picasso is now in the modern era, art doesn't have to be about enjoyment. Perhaps it's something that intentionally disturbs you or is difficult to understand as well if it challenges your thinking. So we'll keep that in mind. Now, one of the things that's frustrating about a work like this is you say, well, what am I supposed to look at? It's just a bunch of colored squares. There's no object. Well, Mondrian would have said there's absolutely an object, and that's because the De Stijl artists did simplify from nature. So, there are versions of these pictures, but, Mondrian might start with something like a tree. And by the way, was a trained, classically trained painter as a young man as well. So it wasn't for his lack of ability that he turned to these paintings like this one right here. In fact, he was quite talented, but he would start with something like this and perhaps start simplifying it, sucking color out of it, make it into something like this, simplify it again, make it into something like this. Perhaps those lines get simplified and become something like this, and then they get reconstituted into other squares, further simplified, and you get something like this. I mean, this is sort of what Mondrian's thinking is, that somewhere hidden in this grid and in these colors, there's, there is an abstraction that comes from observation and from nature. Hard as it is for us to understand that, that was very much his thought process. Now, most of his paintings, follow this similar look, and if you go to art museums around the world today, you can see them. And most of them have similar title, which is composition in red, yellow, blue. And, the whole idea was to scale things back to their bare minimums. I can show you a few more here. So, you have to remember what's happening here as well. So this, if you look at the bottom there, it says PM for Piet Mondrian 1921. So, these are some pretty early paintings here. We were looking at some Dali's as far forward as the, 1960s there at the end. So, this is similar time frame to Munch's Scream, and also a lot of Picasso's earlier paintings as well. So, what's just happened in 1921? Well, the world has completely gone to hell with the First World War, and there's a lot of bleak thinking about the future of the world, and probably not a lot of hope for artistic expression. So, what do we have left here? with everything in ruins, we scale things back. Certainly part of the thought. Mondrian made these throughout the first half of the 20th century. And then eventually, Mondrian had to leave France for the same reason that many artists had to leave France. I mentioned last time that Picasso decided to stay in France because he was so world famous by that time. He felt like he was somewhat untouchable, and turned out to be right. But when the Germans occupied Paris, a lot of artists chose to flee, and the art capital really moved to New York City at that moment. And so Mondrian was among the artists who packed all that he had and came to America in 1945. So here we see some similar works here, and he was fascinated when he got to New York City about how New York City looked, and the grid of the streets and all that, and really embraced it, and lived the last few years of his life there. The importance of de Stil, or this minimalist style, outside of art cannot be overstated. It is everywhere. So, for example, it had a huge impact on fashion. Now, this is a fashion ad from the 1960s here, where you can see, that they've actually, designed a gown kind of based off of a similar look. But, this whole idea of painting in simplified ways. Okay. Also, it gave things that were immediately needed to feel like they were kind of hip to the modern age. All of a sudden, you could kind of take this simplified look, and it provided a cool way to do that. And so fashion eventually, even into the 60s and 70s, owes a great deal to Still paintings. Architecture as well. So this is a famous house called the Rietveld House, which the whole idea was, let's design a house that appears like it's a de Still house, okay, or a simplified Mondrian style painting as a house. And look at, what a building has an awful lot of horizontal and vertical lines, and so you can see how this whole house has been scaled back to vertical and horizontal, and there are bits of color in there. And this would have been down to, even the furniture inside, and everything about it had this scaled back look to it. There's actually a home on Edmond Boulevard, just by Minnehaha's South Campus, that's not this extreme, but is somewhat of a de Still house. If you look at it, it has a red door, and it has big gray and black planes, vertical, horizontal lines, a blue panel, a yellow garage door, that sort of thing. So next time you're driving down there, have a look, and you'll be able to see it as well. So it had a huge impact on architecture locally. Here in the Twin Cities, maybe you've seen the Riverside Apartments. These are these apartments by downtown Minneapolis, not far from the stadium. And you can see it here as well, right? It definitely owes something to this look. And, these were built at a time when, their architects were trying to figure out how to create architecture that seemed like it was with the modern age. And, that was the whole goal behind them here, to try to, add, instead of just having boring flattened planes, to add bits of color, and, to liven it up, but also to, make it feel, like it's part of modern architecture. So it endures in all kinds of subtle and different ways. A few years ago, I was teaching this lesson, and in the class, there was a student who was actually wearing a sweatshirt. That was a Mondrian sweatshirt, and he had no idea. He just thought it was a cool looking sweatshirt. So, look around, and its influence is everywhere in terms of art. The actual piece, Broadway Boogie Woogie, again, Mondrian was living in New York City, looking down at, from his apartment at the grid of New York City. And if you've been there, you know that it's, the whole island of Manhattan is in this perfect grid. So you can figure out where you are if you count the streets or the avenues. And so, yeah, he really saw New York like he'd stepped into this order of one of his paintings with the grid. And he was also fascinated with boogie woogie music, which is this swinging jazz music that was huge in New York in the 1940s. Played with a lot of mutes on trumpets and trombones. In any case, he painted this picture and gave it the very apt title, Broadway Boogie Woogie. And if you think about it, trying to interpret, these little simplified squares and shapes, you can almost picture, the streets of New York City and taxi cabs and flashing lights and billboards and, you know, the movement, the pulsing energy of the city within that grid of the city. I mean, in the simplest way possible, you can kind of, you know, start to feel it a little bit there. It's maybe a little bit of a stretch, but that's the idea behind it. Broadway boogie woogie. So, to sum up what we've learned today, we've got 3 different artists painting here, and taking modern art into new, branching off modern art into new areas. So, with Munch's The Scream, Dali's Persistence of Memory, and Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie. Next time we'll look at a few more modern artists and start to wrap it up. Take care, everyone.